So, Ken, do I have to call you Mr. President?
Well, you can if you want.
Do people call you Mr. President?
Sometimes jokingly.
What honorific is used when you're like at meetings and that?
I kind of live in Berkeley, which is known for its informality. So I'm very happy if people call me Ken. And I've been called, Dr. Ribet and Mr. Ribet and Professor Ribet and Professor Ken and everything else.
But like at AMS board meetings, when you're wearing your president hat, is there something that they have to call you when they're like addressing the chair and that? Is there a proper honorific or?
Oh, no. I have a gavel. And basically, we're all friends.
Do you ever bang the gavel then? Have you ever had to like bang it or call something to order or?
Basically not.
I'm Brady Harron, and this is the Numberphile podcast. Today, our guest is Ken Ribet. He's a math professor at the University of California, Berkeley. In the world of mathematics, Ken's probably best known for his work on Fermat's last theorem. But hang on, I hear you ask, didn't Andrew Wiles prove Fermat's last theorem? Well, yes, but this proof was a huge jigsaw puzzle with earlier contributions, and one of the penultimate puzzle pieces was put in place by Ken. Today he's going to tell us about it and what it was like to be in the actual room when Wiles' proof was finally revealed. But first, in case you can't tell, I am a little bit fascinated by Ken's current role leading the American Mathematical Society, the AMS. How did you become president? Is it just like an informal thing among mathematicians, or is it a competition? Is it like a campaign?
Well, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, I think each president would choose his successor. They were all males. And at a certain point, somebody decided that it might be good to have an election. And I know the candidate who lost the first election. He was confident that he would just be elected without any question. And his opponent actually campaigned by calling up some people and saying, hey, I actually want to do this, so please vote for me. And he won. And there's a nominating committee that meets at the joint meetings and also informally by email all the time. And they're considering candidates for offices like the president and the vice presidents and so on. When they choose someone as a potential candidate, they approach that person and ask him or her whether or not the person will run. And in my case, I was very flattered, and I said, absolutely. And I ran in an election. I had one opponent who is very much like me in a lot of respects. He's from California. We have similar mathematical backgrounds. And I think both of us were viewed as very popular and very well known. And there's no campaigning in the sense of debates or calling your opponent, lying Ted or something. It's still very collegial. But I did make it known to my colleagues at Berkeley that I actually was going to be happy to serve. Very often, if you see someone who's a candidate for something, you say, well, we're going to do that person a favor by voting for the opponent. But I actually wanted to do it. And I was very happy that I won.
Was it a landslide or was it a narrow one?
Well, this is confidential, but it wasn't the sort of situation where we were having to look at hanging chads.
Okay.
But it was reasonably close.
What is the role of the president? You've already referred to presiding over meetings of the council and the behind-the-scenes thing. What else do you have to do? Do you have to go and cut ribbons? And
I do cut ribbons. There's that. Every annual meeting, the president of the American Math Society cuts a very large ribbon with an even larger pair of scissors to open the exhibits. The president presides over the joint prize session at the annual meeting. The president comes to the congressional briefings in Washington, D.C. There are now 2 of them per year, sponsored jointly by MSRI and the American Math Society.
Well, let's talk a bit about your background then. Let's go back in time a bit because there's so many things I want to ask you. One of the first things I want to ask you is about your surname, Ribet. Where is that from?
It's from eastern Poland. It's from a town called Grajewo, which I've never visited. My grandfather was Ribecki. And when he came to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, it was the fashion at Ellis Island to make everyone American as possible. And so I became Ribet, which has become very useful to me in France. And many of my colleagues, they would phone up restaurants to make reservations and try to explain their last names. And if the last name didn't sound French, there'd be a lot of hesitation trying to get the name right and so on.
So people do think it's French sometimes, Ribet or something? Or...
Yeah, well, there are many, many French Ribet. And in fact, on Facebook, you can see there are big clusters of them. And there are people who've contacted me saying, my ancestors came from France through Cuba. Were your ancestors in Cuba? No.
Poland. There was the Ellis Island Corleone moment for your family where the name changes in just a few seconds.
Right.
Where were you born in America?
So I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My parents were both born in New York City. And when I was 3 years old, we moved to a place called Rockaway, which is a part of Queens, but it's a pretty remote part of Queens. Like they don't even have a Starbucks nearby to show you how remote it is. And recently it's become very Brooklynized because it has surfing. And so all the hipsters come from Brooklyn now on the weekends, and many of them have actually moved to Rockaway. So for example, the rock singer Patti Smith bought a house.
Were your parents mathematical, academic type people?
My father was a CPA, an accountant. And when I was a little boy, he would always be adding numbers, either by hand or with a small adding machine. And I was fascinated by numbers. And I would ask my dad to give me, long addition problem. And I think that's what hooked me in.
This was the start, was it?
Yeah.
At school, were you gifted at mathematics? Was that easy for you?
It was my best subject, yeah. So I was a pretty good student, terrible athlete, complete nerd, but I was good at school in kind of all subjects, and math was the easiest.
And was that the path you wanted? Like, if I was to talk to the teenage Ken Ribet, would he have said, I want to be a mathematician one day?
I don't think I knew that there was such a thing called a mathematician. I've told the story many times, but it started when I was a freshman at Brown. I went to my first mathematics course. It was a course in abstract linear algebra, and I loved the material, and I was really taken with the professor, and I looked at this guy. His name was Frank Stewart, and I said, I want to be like that. This is what I want to do. I had still no idea what it actually meant. I didn't know what professors did, how they spent their time. There's a thing called research and committee work and reviewing and traveling. I had no idea what the game was, but I was very taken both with the content, with the mathematics, and also with this kind of freedom from the constraints of business.
What were you at Brown doing?
Well, so I showed up as a freshman with some vague intent to try math and applied math and chemistry. I took one applied math course. It was a year-long course. I didn't like it very much. I never took a chemistry course. So I went straight for math. I did math and broadcast radio. I was on the campus radio station.
Oh, well, I'll be watching your microphone technique with care then. You have to excuse my ignorance about the US college system then. You had been accepted and turned up at Brown to start your university career, and it still wasn't known what you were going to be studying.
That's correct. In the US, when people come to college, they are not really expected to declare their major until their third year. And so there's this idea that they can experiment and try different things. In fact, it's very common. I mean, if you look at what people are majoring in on, say, the Berkeley campus, well, they're majoring in things like social relations and anthropology, theater. It's very rare to take a high school student and say, what do you want to major in? And people will say anthropology. People will talk about their core subjects. Maybe they'll talk about computer science, but they won't think, well, I want to be in geography.
So, Ken, if I was America's most gifted mathematics student at high school and Berkeley wanted me for this reason and offered me a place, I could then say, thanks for my place at Berkeley, but I'm not really interested in mathematics. I happen to be good at it, but I want to be an actor. And I could just do theatre and never even study a jot of mathematics.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay. I mean, the admissions boards, they choose people to try to sculpt the profile of their entering class, and they have an idea of who's coming in, and they could be completely mistaken.
This is new information to me. You did follow this mathematical path, and then you decided pretty early on, I want to be like this role model professor. And you did that eventually, did you?
I did. So I'm the rare example of somebody who set out on a path and just kept walking straight. I mean, most people, Yogi Berra said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. I mean, most people end up doing things that are completely unpredictable. And my thing, I just kept going forward, and there was no obstacle, and I liked it more and more, and here I am.
And then you started having a specialization in mathematics. What was the field of math that ensnared you?
It's a blend of number theory, which is the study of whole numbers, and geometry, which also pretty well understood what that is. So there's a kind of number theory / algebraic geometry subject, which has been coined arithmetical algebraic geometry. So that was my subject. And I came to it because I had some professors at Brown who were kind of very, very forceful. And they said, you're very good in math, read this paper. And there were these two people, Ken Ireland and Michael Rosen, and they were fantastic. They were doing interesting stuff. They were interested in things, and they kind of kept pushing me in different directions. They told me where to go to graduate school, who to work with, what subjects were interesting, and it just meshed well with me.
So was it an aptitude, or was it peer pressure?
Well, so I think I was lucky in that I was pushed into a subject that I'm actually good at. I believe that people have very uneven aptitudes, even within a subject like mathematics. I may not have been very good at geometry or probability or some other subject. I probably would have been okay because, I was kind of good all around. But by luck, I was pushed into a subject that really spoke to me, and I was able to speak back after a while.
At this point, is your ambition to be a teacher, like, a professor in front of a class and inspiring mathematicians, or are you wanting to be like a Gauss and an Euler and, the person who's making the discoveries and having the mathematical fame?
I think the mix is the best thing, because if you do several things and on a given day you're not so good at one of them, well, you turn to the other. Whereas if you're just focused on one thing, like, for example, suppose you have a sabbatical year and you're at a math institute and you know that the entire year you're going to be doing research. Well, at the end of a day, if your pad of paper is still blank, you feel terrible. You haven't done anything. Whereas if you start thinking about something and you kind of keep going in a circle and you've just come back to what you've done before, you say, well, maybe it's time to make up this week's homework.
We're going to come to Fermat's last theorem shortly, in which you played, obviously, a huge role. But at this point, when you're just starting out in this field and you're like, you're one of the new kids on the block, what was the holy grail problem of your topic? What was the thing that you would be lying in bed thinking, gosh, if I could be the person to solve that, that would be amazing?
Well, there are a lot of long-term goals for the subject. One of them, curiously, is the theorem that was proved by Andrew Wiles with the help of Richard Taylor and Brian Conrad and so on, the modularity of elliptic curves. That was a very well-known conjecture that I first heard about as a first-year graduate student. At the time, it was called We's conjecture, after André We, who wrote a paper related to it in 1968. This was kind of a holy grail, but not in the sense that, everyone's trying to do it. It just basically colored the landscape.
But at that point, was that not connected to Fermat's last theorem?
Absolutely not. It had nothing to do with Fermat's last theorem. The thing that I studied, that was my thesis and a lot of my subsequent work, one topic is Galois representations and modular forms, which came into the proof of Fermat's last theorem. So when I was a graduate student, there were countless courses and seminars on subjects like Iwasawa theory, Galois representations, modular forms. These are all things that came together, 20 years later, 25 years later, in the proof of Fermat's last theorem.
Were these kind of like Riemann hypothesis type things where there was already mathematics built on assumptions and you needed to prove it for that to hold? Or was it more just like something in the distance, like a finish line?
Oh, it's a mix. So certainly over time, people became more and more confident that elliptic curves would end up being modular. They thought, it was true, but something we couldn't prove. So they began kind of deriving consequences of it. So that if you derive a consequence of an unproved conjecture, you have a theorem. You can state it in different ways. You could say, assume all elliptic curves are modular, then such and such is true. Another way to spin it, you can say that all elliptic curves that happen to be modular have the following properties.
Perhaps at this point, we should deal with what Fermat's last theorem actually is. Now, there are a few Numberphile videos about it. You can go and check them out. I'll put links down in the show notes. But let's give it a go in audio form. Now, imagine in your head a pretty simple equation, and quite a famous one. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. I'm sure you're familiar with this one. You probably remember it from Pythagoras at school and the right-angled triangles. And the question is, what three positive integers, so whole numbers, can you put in the place of A, B, and C so that the equation works? A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And, well, in this case, there are lots of possible answers. In fact, there are an infinite number of answers. For example, 3, 4, and 5. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared. You could use 5, 12, and 13. You could use 9, 40, and 41. You could use 33, 56, and 65. There are all sorts of ways to crack this nut. These are called Pythagorean triples. But let's up the ante a little bit. Let's not square those numbers. Let's cube them. Raise them to a power of 3. So now we have A cubed plus B cubed equals C cubed. Are there 3 positive integers we can put in there that will make this equation work? You can give it a go if you want, but don't spend too long on it. What about if we raise it to the 4th power? A to the 4 plus B to the 4 equals C to the 4, or any number, any n, A to the nth power plus B to the nth power equals C to the nth power. Are there numbers we can put in that place, positive integers, that will make this equation work? Now, back in 1637, a famous guy called Pierre de Fermat said, no, there's not. And I've got a proof. He wrote in the margin of a book, he just hand scribbled, I've got a proof that you can't do it with anything, except of course the squares. But he said, I haven't got room here in the margin to write the proof. I think I'll come back to it at a later date. He never did, he never wrote the proof, no one ever saw it. And this became known as Fermat's last theorem. Was there a proof that there are no positive integers that you could put in the places of A, B, and C with all these higher powers that would work? Was this impossible? For hundreds of years, no one knew. They'd never found any, but there was no rigorous proof. Now that finally changed when an Englishman named Andrew Wiles gave a famous lecture and revealed a proof. And suffice to say, you wouldn't be writing this proof in the margin of a book. It was really, really complicated, really advanced, cutting-edge new mathematics. So there's Fermat's last theorem. I hope you have some idea of what it is in your head. We're going to get back to it in a minute, but let's get back to our discussion with Ken and find out where he's at in the years leading up to this big moment.
Well, I personally was doing pretty well, although, I had a deep sense of insecurity. Was this worth anything? I wrote a thesis at Harvard that I was kind of vaguely proud of, and I wondered whether anyone would offer me a job.
What was the title of your thesis?
Galois representations attached to abelian varieties with many real multiplications.
Catchy.
Okay, so that was the title. And in fact, my thesis, I wondered whether it would even be published. It kind of sat on my desk for a year and a half, and finally, a mathematician named Serge Lang grabbed it and he said, I'm sending it to the American Journal and I'm going to tell the editor-in-chief to publish it. And he did that. And nothing happened for about 2 years. And finally, I kind of inquired, what ever happened to this? And they asked, and finally it just got published. I was wondering if anyone would ever read it. But it turns out it has lots of citations and people think it's a good thing for background. I was waiting, to hear whether any place would ever offer me a job. And before I expected job offers to come, I got a phone call from Princeton University asking me to come and be basically a postdoc. So I was there it's hard to count the years because the 3rd year that I was supposedly in Princeton, I got a fellowship to study in Paris. So that was my first year in Paris. And I actually taught at Princeton for a total of 3 years with this year in Paris kind of sandwiched between the 2nd and 3rd year.
You got to take that Ribet surname out for a test drive.
Yeah, in fact, one of the first things I did was to take the metro to the Impasse Ribet, which is a little alleyway. And I certainly have photos of myself standing in front of the Impasse Ribet.
Excellent. And then what happened after that 3 years? Where were you next?
In the last year at Princeton, I got a phone call from Berkeley saying, how would you like to come out and join our faculty? So this was completely unexpected. I hadn't applied to Berkeley, but secretly, when I thought about universities where I might go, Berkeley was probably at the top of the list because it was one of the top 3 universities in terms of mathematics, the other 2 being Harvard and Princeton. And I had visited Berkeley once for a week on my way to a conference. I just thought it was paradise. So I tried my best to hide my enthusiasm when they phoned me up. I ultimately accepted an offer of an associate professorship at Berkeley and promptly went to Paris again for a year. And so I first came to Berkeley kind of a year and a half after the initial phone call.
What was it about Berkeley? Because the Ken I know, you're Berkeley through and through. You're such a Berkeley guy to me. But I guess then you were a real East Coast guy. So what was it about Berkeley that appealed to you?
Well, it was kind of the light and the kind of joy, the informality. And Telegraph Avenue was full of people wearing tie-dye shirts. And it was kind of like the 60s was still going on.
But you're an East Coast guy. Wouldn't you look at that shun that? Weren't you this Brooklyn guy who would think, oh, those hippies over there?
Well, I'm thinking of someone I know who works in San Diego who applied for a job. And in his interview, he said, I'm a Californian trapped in the body of an Englishman. So maybe I was a Californian trapped in the body of an East Coast person.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's jump forward then to Fermat's last theorem. What did you do? How did you suddenly find yourself in this spotlight? This is before Wiles, before the proof.
This is before Wiles, so this is in the early to mid 1980s. There was this guy, Gerhard Frey, who keeps coming up in all the discussions of it. And he was the first person that I knew of to try to think about the links between elliptic curves and solutions to Fermat's last theorem. So at the time, there was a lot of study about elliptic curves with various properties. And if you had an elliptic curve with various properties, you could derive from that elliptic curve the solution to some equation. And there was a movement, one of the mathematicians was a Russian mathematician, Demyanenko, where you try to rule out certain kinds of elliptic curves by deriving from the existence of the elliptic curve a solution to an equation that didn't have solutions. So that was the subject. And it was going back and forth between elliptic curves and solutions. And Frey somehow stumbled on this idea that if you had a solution to Fermat's last theorem, this would give you an elliptic curve with extremely problematic properties. And he kind of went around telling people about this, and he came to Berkeley and spoke to me and gave a talk. And I was very unconvinced. I kind of really didn't believe it. This is around 1982 or 1983. And over the next year or two, he came to this idea that if elliptic curves were known to be modular, it should be possible to prove Fermat's last theorem. And he wrote a manuscript that was like 2 or 3 pages with an outline of the assertion that the modularity of elliptic curves implies Fermat's last theorem. And he was well aware of the fact that his outline was not at all complete. But he was hoping that people who were experts in the theory of modular curves, like me, I guess, would fill in all the blanks and kind of make the thing okay. I was still completely unconvinced. I didn't kind of know that he was right. But he gave lectures in Europe, and a lot of European mathematicians in 1984-85, that academic year, started thinking about his lectures and his little manuscript and thinking about ways to justify this idea that the modularity of elliptic curves could imply Fermat's last theorem. And one of the signal things that happened was that Jean-Pierre Serre wrote down a longer manuscript. It was a letter to Jean-François Mestre, French mathematician, explaining that if you could only prove what Serre thought was a tiny little assertion, he called it epsilon, meaning a small number, then you could actually justify what Frey had started to do.
So this was like a little screw or just a little piece of the puzzle, but it was really, really important to hold it all together.
Yeah. So in other words, Serre's letter basically said, Frey looks like he's right. You just have to prove this one extra thing. And this was in the summer of 1985. And I got a copy of the letter. We were all together at some conference in Northern California. And I started thinking about this epsilon. And it was really right in the center of things that I understood.
Were you thinking about it, Ken, because it was like an itch in your brain and a curiosity? Or were you thinking greatness awaits if this can be solved?
Well, I thought that the connection with Fermat was kind of the icing on the cake, but I'm not one of these people who say, I kind of went to the library when I was a 10-year-old and read about Fermat's last theorem, and it was my great goal. It was a challenge. It was a mathematical challenge. It was right in my subject. It was something that I thought I could do, and I was responding to that challenge. The connection with Fermat made it, even more important to think about.
Like any mathematician, you knew of Fermat's last theorem. It was just like a famous thing. But I'm not going to ask you to explain it and the proof and the mathematics because I wouldn't understand it and you can't do it in a podcast. But how did you do it? Where did you do it? Did you do it lying in the bath? Were you walking along the bay? Did you just sit in your office with a notepad and a pencil? Where did you crack this nut?
Oh, so I thought about it off and on for a year. This was the academic year 1985-86. And I was teaching calculus, and whenever I had a spare moment, I thought a little bit about this problem and asked myself whether I had any special insight into it that other people didn't have. And at the end of the teaching, so this would be in May 1986, I started thinking about the problem more seriously. I was on my way to Europe. So the first thing that I did was I went to Harvard for basically a week So I had an office that I was able to use, and I was also staying with my sister in Wellesley. I remember sitting at her kind of breakfast table in Wellesley thinking about this thing and realizing that I knew something that I hadn't realized before that I knew, that I had the beginning of some complicated argument that seemed to do a special case of it. So I got very excited. And then I flew to Europe. I was in Paris for a while, and then I showed up at the Max Planck Institute in Bonn. And in all of these places, I had my pad of paper, and I would write the thing. And by the time I got to Bonn, soon after my arrival, this is probably around June 1st, 1986, I realized that I could do what I thought was only a special case of the epsilon conjecture. So the epsilon conjecture, you try to understand something mathematically, you say, well, what's the first possible situation where you have to prove something, the simplest possible situation? So I kind of looked at the theorem in that case, and this was really right up my alley. It was this kind of thing that I'd studied many times before. In fact, I had studied conjecture epsilon in the special case kind of 10 or 15 years before, and realized that I didn't know how to do it and wondered whether it was true. But here I was thinking about the problem again, and I realized that I could actually do something. So this was kind of very exciting to me, and I kind of wrote the thing over and over again on different sheets of paper, and I convinced myself that it was actually true. And I started talking to people about it in Bonn, and I might have given a lecture or two in Bonn. And I also wrote a letter, a physical letter on paper to Barry Mazur at Harvard, and I mailed him the letter. And I didn't hear back. And then there's this famous story with the cappuccino in August of 1986 in Berkeley. There was the International Congress of Mathematicians that happened to be in Berkeley. Barry Mazur was there, and I said, hey, I sent you this letter, and I'm trying to work on the general case, and you didn't respond to the letter. And Barry looked at me, and he said, well, of course, you have done the general case. You just have to do something slightly different. So he thought he was just, sprinkling some powder on it and telling me something that I should have realized long ago. So we went and had a coffee at some cafe at the edge of campus. It's now called Cafe Strata, and we sat there, and as soon as he explained the thing in one or two sentences, what I had to do extra, I realized that there was going to be no problem, that the thing was going to work.
Why did Barry not reply to your letter to tell you that? Or did he think you already knew?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe he was thinking about other things, or he thought I already knew. And I guess his attitude was, well, Ken will figure it out by himself.
What do you say to Barry about that now? Do you kick him and say, why didn't you tell me a year earlier?
Well, I don't think we've discussed this subject recently.
So when you published this proof and it had all been set in stone, this sort of bridge or pathway to proving Fermat's last theorem had been opened, but not yet passed through. Was that a big deal? Like, were you a celebrity for a week? Was this, this is amazing? Or because the last piece, because the step onto Fermat hadn't been made yet, was it still just an obscure mathematical paper in the scheme of things? Or was this like making waves?
No, it made a lot of waves. Not to the extent that Fermat's last theorem itself made waves, but it made waves within mathematics. So I was approached by journalists who wanted me to kind of talk about the proof for various popular and scientific magazines. Everyone knew about it in mathematics, that this thing had happened. And there was also a certain amount of skepticism. Is this proof going to work out? Because I didn't have a complete manuscript. It hadn't been accepted for publication. I gave lectures. I explained all these things. And a lot of the proof was so convoluted to people that they thought it couldn't possibly be correct. At least some people felt that way.
You and others have helped open this door and shown this path. Does this create like a mad scramble? Is there now a race? Is there a frenzy now for Mars available? And are you in this race?
I thought that the assertion that needed to be proved, the modularity of elliptic curves, was completely beyond the techniques at that time. So I thought what I had done was to convince people that Fermat's last theorem was true morally because people believed in the modularity of elliptic curves, but I had no expectation that anyone, 7 years later would claim to prove that elliptic curves are modular.
A bit like the Riemann hypothesis. Everyone believes it's true, but no one seems to be able to prove it.
Right. So I thought this was a completely inaccessible problem.
Did people start trying, though? Did it create this new buzz, this new field of endeavor?
Well, Not that I was aware of. Now, it turns out, of course, Wiles went to his attic and worked on this thing quietly, but apparently other people were having kind of similar ideas. Maybe there's a way to do this.
Did you know Andrew Wiles, this guy in England?
Oh, yeah. So I met him the first year that I was in Paris. Let's think about this. This was 1975-76. So I was in Paris for the year, and Wiles's advisor, John Coates, would invite me to Cambridge. Basically, he said, whenever you're tired of Paris and want to spend a week in Cambridge, just come over, and we have a room for you. You give a lecture. We can pay some travel expenses. We'll invite you to High Table. So I came to Cambridge, maybe 4 or 5 times, maybe even more during that year, and Wiles was Coates' student. And in fact, the thing that I had done by the end of the year was something that also created a lot of interest in mathematics. I proved what's now viewed as the converse to a theorem of Herbron, Jacques Herbron. And I was lecturing on this in Cambridge, and Wiles got very excited. And one of his first papers was to take what I did and go beyond that. And then his most famous paper after that was a joint paper with Barry Mazur, where they proved something called the main theorem of Iwasawa theory. And they did that by using techniques that were derived from mine.
So part of the mythology of Andrew Wiles now is that he was obsessed with Fermat's last theorem from boyhood. Did you know this? Would he always, every time you met him, would he talk to you about, how do you think we can solve Fermat's last theorem? Or did he keep this secret? Or did you know that this was one of the people in the world who...
I had no knowledge of it. I mean, I take him at his word. And in fact, what he says is that he was obsessed with Fermat, and the adults in the room told him, don't think about that. Here are some fruitful problems that you can think about. And he took their advice. But he did, at least by self-report, have this special obsession.
So anyway, he does go up in the attic. Well, eventually he does crack this nut. How did you find out about this? You were kind of almost part of this too, not part of the work, but you were very much Johnny on the spot when this all finally emerged into the light, weren't you?
Well, okay, so in June 1993, there was a conference in Cambridge, and I was invited. I was one of the speakers. And at a typical conference, you have, a number of speakers, maybe 4 or 5, 6 per day, and no one speaks more than once. And Wiles had told the organizers that he had something very special that he wanted to present, and it would require 3 separate lectures on 3 consecutive days, and he was booked for this. And after the first and second lecture, there was widespread speculation that he was going to prove the modularity of a very wide class of elliptic curves, and this would be enough to prove Fermat's last theorem.
But this wasn't like the title of his talk. It was cloaked in some secrecy, was it?
Well, the title of his talk, in fact, I joke that both in my article and in Wiles's article, Fermat's equation appears in the introduction and never after that. Both articles are about the technicalities of modular forms, modular curves, Galois representations. These are the tools that we'd all been working with. And Wiles's lectures had a title like that.
But it becomes clear that day 3 might be the big moment. And you cottoned onto this, didn't you?
Yeah. In fact, someone kind of whispered to me that this was going to happen after the second day. So it wasn't a surprise to me because I actually had some knowledge. But even if I hadn't, I would have expected something like that. And there was a huge audience for his lecture. A lot of people had cameras. A lot of people brought their friends who were not in the subject. And they said, come to this lecture. Something historic is going to happen.
What was it like being in that room?
It was joyful. It was electrifying. It was kind of a celebration. When I was a graduate student, my relatives would say to me, well, what are you doing this for? What kind of subject is this? And I would say, well, basically what we're trying to do ultimately is solve equations, because that's something people can understand. And, it was wonderfully validating after all these years that we were actually solving an equation.
You took a camera, for which I am forever grateful, because I think you got the photo.
I may have. I certainly had a film camera there, and I took a number of photos. And then there were some group photos that I appear in that were taken by other mathematicians who were there.
There's one of him at the blackboard.
I think I took a photo like that, yeah.
Yeah, he's smiling, and it's he doesn't seem like the world's smiliest man, and he's got this glow about him.
He did. He couldn't suppress his pride.
And straight afterwards, there was all this buzz and attention, and you kind of ended up having to be a bit of a spokesman, didn't you?
Yeah. First of all, the staff at the Newton Institute knew in advance that something was going to happen, and they chilled cases of sparkling wine. It was actually Napa Valley sparkling wine.
Of course.
That was served after his lecture. There was a lot of buzz. And as soon as the lecture ended, someone came up to Andrew and said, Gina Colada from the New York Times is on the phone. Will you speak to her? And Andrew turned to me and he said, can you talk to her? So I went into an office. It was actually my office, and I sat underneath my desk in order to have some soundproofing because there was a lot of chatter in the hallways. And I spoke to her, for maybe a half hour, and I outlined the whole thing. And the next morning, our names were on the front page of the New York Times, which is kind of remarkable. So like my parents, got the New York Times delivered to their driveway, and they open it up and there's their son on the very front page. And there was this possibly unfortunate term that she used. She kind of referred to me as Andrew's spokesman. So it was true that he asked me to speak for him in that context, but then somehow it became known in the press that I was the official spokesman for Andrew Wiles. So I was kind of like his press secretary or something. And I got hundreds of inquiries from all sorts of publications and radio shows and TV shows. And my attitude was I would speak to everyone. And they asked me the same questions over and over again. Did Andrew Wiles prove Fermat's last theorem? And I basically said yes. And occasionally I would mention that I had done some preliminary work, but that rarely made the write-ups.
No.
It was all about Andrew Wiles.
There's a whole Numberphile video about that though, Ken.
Okay. It was an interesting situation to kind of deal with the popular press. I'd never had this happen in my life before. And I found that I was fairly good at it. I could explain things to people who didn't know anything about mathematics, and I thought it was a good use of my time.
The other famous part of the story, of course, is that the Wiles proof was then found to have a flaw. What was that like for you? Did that hang you out to dry?
It really did, because first of all, when Andrew first heard about the flaw in July of 1993, I guess he didn't believe that it was all that serious. He thought it just needed patching up. So he must have been aware that I was out there, beating his drum, but he never told me. So it took months before I found out how serious the problem was. And I had been kind of out there saying, Andrew Wiles had proved Fermat's last theorem. So I'm glad that it worked out.
Right. So just to patch up that story, Wiles worked with another mathematician, Taylor, and they did fix the problem. They brought it back from the brink and it all held.
Yeah. So Taylor and Wiles huddled together and they thought about various things. And finally, they or Andrew or Richard found the missing piece. And they published that as a joint paper.
You talked about when you were working on Epsilon, you were giving lectures and you were writing letters. You wrote letters to Barry Mazey. It was this open book, wasn't it? You were sharing everyone how you were progressing and asking for help.
I was.
Andrew Wiles famously sort of didn't do that. He kept it very secret and then he revealed everything at once in like a big grand reveal. Does that confuse you or does that delight you? How do you feel about these two different ways of doing mathematics?
Well, I certainly liked my model better, but Andrew had a very good excuse, which is that Fermat was such a kind of sought-after thing that if he revealed that he was working on the problem, people would have rushed in. And it was very important to him to be the person who proved Fermat's last theorem.
I'd keep it secret if I was close, I think, but then again, I'm not a mathematician. So you played a great role in this amazing thing, probably one of the greatest things that's happened in mathematics in the last, 100 years or so, certainly. Where do you go from there? What do you do next? Even you, who was a side player in it, it's still like a big deal. It must be one of your crowning achievements. What do you do next?
Well, there is an encore problem. There's no question about that. And what I've done, if I look off to the side and say, what has Ken Ribet done? Well, I've done a surprising amount of outreach and professional service. And I think that's something that I'm pretty good at. I've done more research. I've had graduate students. I've solved problems. I've proved theorems. But I haven't done anything as great as the contribution to Fermat's last theorem. Realistically, I'm not looking for that. So I'm looking for some balance where I continue to contribute to research. And also now I'm a pretty well-known and well-regarded sort of senior mathematician. So I do things at the National Academy of Sciences. I'm also kind of the chair of the class of math and physical sciences at the moment. I work with the American Math Society. So I feel that I'm still contributing in different ways.
Do you think you can't contribute in those other ways anymore? There's this great cliche or this thing that's said about, particularly mathematics, that, your prime is leading up to about 40, and after that, you haven't quite got it like you used to have it. Do you buy that? Do you believe that?
Well, you kind of maybe lose some speed, but you have lots of wisdom, and you can recognize situations that some people may not.
Let me talk to you about photography and photos, because you seem to love photos.
I do love photos.
And you're always taking them. We've taken pictures. Even today, there was like a fan here in the room that captured your eye and you wanted to take a photo of it. What is it about you and photography and photos? It's just like a hobby?
It is a hobby. There's no question about that. So when I first came to Berkeley, I had no camera. And I was, as I said, fascinated by the light and all the scenes in Berkeley. So I bought my first camera.
What was it?
It was an Olympus OM1. So this is a film camera, and it had no flash, and I went around and I took photos, and I would get them developed in photography stores. So I'd come back, with color photos. And then someone said to me, well, you really like photography. Why don't you do black and white photography and go in a dark room? And there is a dark room on campus, and the dark room is beautiful, had lots of equipment. There were courses you could take with accomplished Bay Area photographers. So I did all that, and I spent a lot of time in the darkroom, and it became the thing that I would do at the end of a day of mathematics. At 5 o'clock, I would go in the darkroom, and I'd kind of emerge 3 hours later with lots of prints and lots of negatives and start thinking about dinner. And with digital photography, it became a lot easier. You can just snap pictures and post them in various places. So that's kind of a sideline.
Anyone who's been on your website, in addition to all the mathematical content on there's all sorts of other little bits of trivia and interesting things. And one of the sections I can't stop looking at is the haircut section. Tell me about that.
Oh, well, so many years ago, I started taking haircuts with one particular stylist who is no longer coming to Berkeley. And we together hatched this idea of taking photos of the two of us at the end of every haircut. I kind of believe in the power of a sequence of photos. Even if one photo doesn't reveal all that much, having a long sequence of similar photos again and again shows you kind of the arc of time, and there are various details that appear and disappear, people walking past in the back. So I really like that. And I took a photo of every haircut. And then when my stylist decided that it was no longer worth her time to drive to Berkeley from San Jose, the photos ended. And this was quite a few years ago.
The other thing, I follow you on Facebook, and the other thing I find interesting is you have these really regular lunch meetings. Explain what they are.
When I was a student, both at Brown and at Harvard, there was some tradition that faculty members could have lunch and other meals if they wanted to with students. And I found it really valuable to me to meet all sorts of people who would come and sit around with students. I remember, for example, meeting Yo-Yo Ma when he was a freshman. He was at one of the tables, and there were lots of public figures who would come in and sit with us. And I thought that was really wonderful. And when I came to Princeton, I asked whether or not there was such a program, and there was. So I became a faculty fellow at various dining halls. And when I came to Berkeley, there was no such thing. And I kind of wondered for a long time whether such a thing might crop up. And when I started teaching very large courses that had formerly been small courses, in the math department at one point, we began teaching third-year courses in large rooms, whereas before they'd only been taught in groups of 25 or 30 students. I thought, this might be a way to get to know the students, and I would organize lunches in the dining halls. And I pitched this to the College of Letters and Sciences, and they were all on board. They gave me a card so that I could get free lunches, and I would sit with the students, and I found that it was really valuable, and they liked it. And then somehow this morphed about 5 years ago into organizing breakfasts and lunches at the faculty club. The faculty club likes it. They get lots of business. The students like being in the faculty club, and I tell them they can come back anytime they want. They don't need a faculty member. All they need is a credit card or a wallet. And some of the students have taken me up on the suggestion. And I think it's a nice way to get to meet students informally and find out a little bit about their lives.
So you normally put like a post on Facebook, don't you? And you basically say, this week I'm going to be here at this time, come along if you want. And then this handful of students will come and you'll just hang out over a meal.
That's right.
What do they normally want? Is there a pattern to what happens in the conversation, or?
It depends on the size of the group. So a small group, they'll ask me about myself, and they'll be a little bit uncomfortable. It's kind of intimidating to be with a faculty member, and they're addressing questions to me, like, how did I come to be a mathematician? What do I do in my spare time? What is it like? How long have you been at Berkeley? So those sometimes, if I don't know the students, can be a little bit rough. But then there are bigger events where there'll be, 10, 12 students. And then what happens is they just talk to each other. And I'm there kind of almost like a fly on the wall. I mean, some of them will talk to me, but everybody's much more relaxed. And I find those to be the most successful.
And then coming back to your passion for photography, it seems like at the end of almost every one of these, there's like a group photo.
There's a staff member at the faculty club, Jerry Fowler, who's a fantastic photographer, and he takes photos of the group. And he really gets the best expressions out of people. I think people warm up to him immediately.
So if you go like on your Facebook, almost every week there'll be this, it's almost like the exact same picture, but with a different cast of characters each time.
Right. And you see the seasons changing, the colors of the leaves. Some of the photos, everyone's wearing an overcoat. Some of the photos, people are in summer clothes.
You do seem to enjoy teaching more than a lot of other academics I know. Sometimes academics seem to treat it like it's their chore, it's the pound of flesh they have to pay to be allowed to be researchers, but you seem to really delight in it.
Well, it's a kind of communication. It's a different skill. It's a different activity. It's not explaining technical math to people who are committed to mathematics. And I think everyone on the Berkeley campus, because it's such a large public university, is committed to that kind of teaching, because someone who comes here and realizes that there's that kind of teaching almost every semester and doesn't like it will go elsewhere.
And what's next for you then as we come to the end of our chat? What's your next big thing? I guess the next part of your presidency is a big part of your life at the moment.
As my presidency is coming toward an end, it ends on February 1st, 2019.
And you're term limited?
Well, there's never been a situation where someone has done it twice. My successor, Jill Pfeiffer, is a mathematician at Brown. After her, there are two candidates who are now recruited for the next election. One of them will be Jill's successor. On February 1st, 2019, I will become the official immediate past president. So this is an actual title of the AMS. And for example, as immediate past president, I will be the representative of the American Math Society to a joint meeting with the Vietnamese Math Society next June.
You're taking on almost like a deputy or a vice presidency type role when you're the immediate past, or?
Yeah, so at every moment, there are two presidents in the AMS. There's the president, and then there's either the president-elect who shadows the president, or the immediate past president who helps out as needed. And after my 1 year as immediate past president, the next person who will have been elected will sign on as president-elect.
And then you got any plans we should know about? You're not secretly working in an attic on another proof, are you?
I'll stay mum as to my plans.
Thanks for listening. This episode was recorded in a small office overlooking the San Francisco Bay at the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute, which is in Berkeley, California. I'm sorry you couldn't enjoy the view with us. The episode was also sponsored by a company in Berkeley called Maya Sound. They're an audio engineering and manufacturing company. They're not here to advertise or sell anything, they're just supporting the show. But they're always doing interesting things and love sharing their research going on in the labs. So if you want to check them out, go to mayasound.com. There's a link down in the show notes. And we'll be back again soon with another episode here on our Numberphile podcast.